Midi à tous. En ouvrant cette première séance très générale, je voudrais à mon tour remercier les organisateurs, remercier Sandrine Maljean-Dubois, son équipe, tous ceux qui ont été cités tout à l'heure et dont je mesure, en vous voyant si nombreux, l'énormité du travail, l'immensité du travail qu'ils ont dû accomplir. Je voudrais dire que c'est pour moi un très grand plaisir personnel alors d'être ici, un peu émouvant, parce qu'il se trouve que cela me renvoie à l'époque où, jeune professeur, j'étais dans cette même salle en train de délivrer le cours de droit constitutionnel, et c'était il y a 53 ans. Tempus fugit. Donc ça fait un certain effet. Bien. Moving to the substance of our meeting, I don't want to speak long because it's not for the moderator to speak, it's for the speakers to do so. So I will just briefly mention that we are in an opening discussion, the long quest for fairness. So it deals with very global and general concepts, problems, questions, etc. Both of them will address you on this general scope, leaving space, of course, for future discussions in the different panels which will follow until Saturday, where I'm not quite sure that we will be able on Saturday to answer at the end this question by yes or no, or black and white, as said Laurence, but I am sure that at the end of the day we'll have good discussions and a very instructive exchange of views. So I will give the floor in the order indicated in the program. We'll start with Professor Bianchi from the Graduate Institute in Geneva. I would like to mention that the Hague Academy, in my capacity as president of the Hague Academy of International Law, I am glad to say that we'll host him in the near future. And he will deliver a course dealing on different ways of thinking about international law. It means that this is certainly one of the problems he's thinking about for long, and it has something to do. It is more or less in the same vein as the elements which will be treated this afternoon and on these several days. Then we will listen to Professor Slim Lamrani from l'Université de Carthage, who also delivered a course at the Hague Academy, and I would like to suggest you to read the course he delivered because it's absolutely fantastic, on Islam et droit international. It is in French. It has been published in the pocketbook series of the Hague Academy, and it is a really fascinating course. So I don't want to speak more long, and I give immediately the floor to Professor Andrea Bianchi. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. I tend to take speaking engagement seriously, so when some months ago I was invited to take part in this opening roundtable, I went back to long-forgotten readings, read new, at least to me, materials, and made new discoveries. As you delve further into such fundamental issues, the risk of feeling lost is a real one, and lost I felt. Navigating through Aristotle and John Rawls, with lots in between to be found in philosophy, law, and international law, in particular with Thomas Frank, as explained by Scobie, and Simpson, ethics, theology, psychology, and I'm probably overlooking some other important ones I've read from. Justice as fairness, justice is fairness, or maybe just a handitis, the two terms pretty much complementing each other and representing only one concept. Fairness as a process or a journey towards a destination which is not fixed in advance. Procedural and or moral fairness, the first being easier to realize. Or fairness as discourse, in which the tension between order and change is negotiated societally. For all these statements, one can offer authority and an erudite citation, possibly also definition. Oh, we love definitions as lawyers. They give to the law and to our own selves, the certainty we both need. But sometimes definitions are straitjackets that do not fully account for the complexity of reality. All words, they are negotiable commodities that can be traded in the market of ideas, society, or the individual conscience. In particular contexts, you think you may have found a convincing explanation that legitimizes their distinction. Many of you may find that it is not just, it's unjust that I'm here speaking at the inaugural event of the European Society and that the other colleagues should be in my place because they're more competent or for whatever other reasons you may want to put forward. But since I've been selected to be a speaker with Slim and Ineta, few would object to the fact that I'm entitled to the same amount of speaking time as my colleagues, as this is only fair. On second thoughts, however, you may swap the terms and say it's unfair that I've been selected to speak, but it's only just that I speak exactly the same time as the others. You would hardly know the difference. The fact is that to distinguish between fairness and justice remains a rather intractable problem. Fairness, justice, equality, equity, reasonableness, and the likes of them are often presented as universal values. These days, however, they are almost systematically looked at and dealt with a certain degree of skepticism. They certainly come loaded with a Western bias, even though they remain popular for different, if not opposite reasons, among lawyers and legal systems belonging to different traditions. They might have lost some of their once unquestioned appeal, but they still enjoy an aura of authority and credibility. No one would have the temerity to say nowadays that there is a clear-cut and universally shared notion of what fairness and justice are about. More than 30 years of critical theory in the discipline and 2 millennia of philosophy would not have passed in vain, would they? But at all latitudes, there is a sense, an idea of what justice and fairness are or should be about. Does it mean that at the end of the conference you will know much more about the subject? Chances are that you won't. But maybe some flashes of light or some sparks of interest may trigger some further reflection, some glimpse of an eluding truth. Fairness remains an ever-shifting goal, most likely unattainable, at least in a full-fledged way, sometimes indistinguishable from other closely related concepts, and always perspectival. It depends whom you ask, the position they're in, the beliefs they have. Do these considerations provide good grounds for setting fairness aside and adhere to a radical critique mode of thinking? No, not at all. That would be a wrong move. In fact, my approach and disposition towards the matter changed when I thought of another instance in which I had to face a similar challenge in presenting about a topic. When I was invited 10 years ago to Cambridge to give the keynote speech at a conference about interpretation, I had long wandered aimlessly in my thoughts before my attention was drawn to Stanley Fish's well-known quote about law. Interpretation is the only game in town. And everyone focused on the question of whether law can be reduced to interpretation. But I thought that to focus on the other prong of the citation, the game, was far more interesting and carried much explanatory thought when it comes to legal interpretation. So this became the focus of my analysis and the overarching metaphor for the book that I edited with my friends Matt Whitten-Windsor and Daniel Peet, who is in the room. Likewise, this time, I thought that it might be more productive to shift the focus from fairness as such to the quest for it, to which I now turn. And that's my first point, the quest. In the myriad versions of Arthurian legends and epic, you may recall that the quest for the Holy Grail is a very popular account. Everyone knows it, or bits of it at least. Arthur and the Round Table Knights, Lancelot, Percival, Galahad, Bors, Sir Mordred, I can't name them all, set out on the quest for the Holy Grail. And we all are taken up with their quests, mesmerized at their fights with evil forces and black knights and enchanted forests in timeless spaces. We are tantalized by their determination, by their faith in the pursuit. We identify with them and we feel part of that universe of noble ideals, firm commitment, and relentless efforts to secure the good to the detriment of evil. But neither they nor we know exactly what the Holy Grail actually is like. It could be a dish or a bowl, a stone, a cup in the shape of a martini glass, actually, but I doubt that martini was a popular drink at the time. Nor does one know exactly what its origin are. Is it where Christ's blood was kept by his disciples after the crucifixion? Or is it the cup from which Jesus drank at Last Supper? We don't know. What one knows is that it is something of great value. But when they are called upon to say exactly what value, no one knows for sure. It could bring about wealth, prosperity, justice for all, the promise of eternal youth, or a mystical union with God. But yet again, we don't know exactly. And the only one who actually drank from it, the most pure-hearted knight of all, Galahad, cannot say, because after drinking, he died and went straight into heaven, the proximity to God being the ultimate reward for the ones who found it. Is the quest for the Holy Grail by the Round Table Knights a myth? Possibly. Supernatural heroes appear in it, and the story turned into a traditional account may help explain something that we experience in everyday life. To strive to achieve something of value, to make us accept that this may come at a price, the demarcation between good and evil. But most of all, the quest is an archetype, a mental representation deeply ingrained in the collective unconscious of many different cultures. As such, the archetype provides a narrative which frames our actions and thoughts, a never quite finished script for our aspirations and desires. The quest is inspired by shared beliefs, and its pursuit ends up buttressing them. It creates expectations, gives a sense of community, of unity of purpose. Neither the Holy Grail nor fairness, the quest for them. The quest for fairness is all that matters. This is what nourishes the hope of institutions, social actors, and legal scholars for a better world. It is the process of searching, striving for achieving something, having a sense of purpose. And in the course of the pursuit, and that's my second point, many things may happen. There are moments in which evil forces in the form of unfairness, inequalities, and injustice seem to prevail. Fairness and justice may succumb to them, and the danger of endemic conflict, relativism, and the likes may loom through the horizon. And this is the reason why avatars of fairness are occasionally created in specific context to indulge the illusion that such a noble ideal can actually be turned into reality and eventually shape the content of the whole system. Avatars, that's my second point. When I talk about avatars, I do not mean the icons that you may use in the digital world to represent yourself and your digital identity. I rather mean to refer to the symbolic representations of something important. And these representations may come to incarnate or stand for fairness in a certain particular context. What I have in mind is all those instances in which fairness is invoked or applied in international law to create the sentiment that a rule, a principle, a procedure, or a decision partakes of such higher noble ideal. And the avatars may come under different guises and can be named fairness, equity, reasonableness, occasionally even common sense. International law attempts to create avatars of fairness whenever it can. The delimitation of the continental shelf must be equitable and conform with equitable principles. The benefit of deep seabed mining must be equitably shared, although how to do that remains an open question. But the symbolic force of the avatar is there. The law of non-navigational uses of international water courses is replete with references to equity. Their use must be equitable. Disputes in this domain must be equitably solved. Even in human rights, there is so much concern for something which is close to fairness and equity in different places. But, you know, the first thing I can think of is due process and the guarantees that a fair trial. That's not that I have exhausted my time yet, so it's my own counting.
Yeah, but it's right. You have 2 minutes.
And so these avatars of fairness are extremely important. In Hinduism, avatars are incarnations of deity in human or other mundane forms to counter the evil of the world and they carry with it a huge symbolic potential. They descend to earth to redress injustices and wrongs. But despite the divine origins of this particular religious tradition, there is always some evocative, powerful evocative power inherent in the invocation of rules and principles inspired by fairness. The particularity of fairness in specific context is in and of itself an avatar for the universality of justice. So let me jump to my third and last point, a very brief one, something that came to my mind when I was reading about it, and this has to do with the mirror. I've always been fascinated by Lacan's idea that our development is strongly influenced in the early stages of development in our infancy by what Lacan called the mirror's stage. The infant looking at the mirror sees a complete and functional body of which they have no real awareness given our limited sensorial and intellectual development at that age. What they see feels other, and that's how we learn that we need others to be who we are. Self and other become interdependent. At the same time, what they see in the mirror's reflected image is a perfectly functional whole that does not match the perception of themselves. This vision induces the desire and the aspiration to be like the image that they see, the image of an ideal I, and an attainable goal to which we strive and aspire all our lives. Likewise, my point in this context is this: there is always value in looking at the mirror of an ideal, not just to contemplate the image of ourselves as other, but also to realize that we will always strive to reach those unattainable goals that reflect our desires and aspirations. Most likely, we will often feel lacking, not being able to fully realize them, but it certainly is worth the endeavor to pursue them and to engage in their quest as lawyers, as professionals, and most of all as human beings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A question may be put to Professor Bianchi, but after the different speeches, we have questions at the end of the session. Now I give the floor to Professor Himla.
Bonjour tout le monde, merci à Les Îles de m'avoir invité à participer à cette conférence sur un sujet qui me tient particulièrement à cœur. Vous l'avez compris, je vais parler en langue française. Le sens commun, notamment, mais pas exclusivement dans les pays du Sud, en veut au droit international. Son procès est fait aussi bien par ceux qui le connaissent que ceux qui l'ignorent. On lui reproche à la fois de ne pas être, c'est la loi du plus fort, de ne pas être effectif, c'est de l'encre sur du papier, et de ne pas être juste, il est avantageux au plus fort. Ces reproches, adressés en même temps au droit international, posent un problème logique. On ne peut, sans se contredire, contester l'existence du droit international, constater son ineffectivité et dénoncer son injustice. En effet, si le droit international n'existe pas, poser le problème de son ineffectivité ou évaluer sa justice est un non-sens. De même, s'il est ineffectif, la question de sa justice ou de son injustice ne présente pas un grand intérêt. En d'autres termes, la justice suppose l'effectivité et l'effectivité suppose l'existence. On peut, si on adopte une conception normativiste du droit, concéder sans peine l'existence du droit international. Si l'on définit le droit comme un ensemble de normes, et si on définit la norme comme une signification particulière, la signification que quelque chose doit être ou doit advenir, on doit en conclure que l'existence du droit n'est pas un fait empirique. Le droit étant un système normatif, son mode d'existence particulier est la validité. Et la validité est une question de droit et n'est pas une question de fait. Pour montrer l'existence de normes ou leur validité, il faut établir qu'elles ont été posées par un organe compétent, déterminées par des normes secondaires, au sens que Herbert Hart donne à ce concept, conformément à la procédure établie à cet effet par d'autres normes secondaires, qu'elles sont entrées en vigueur et qu'elles n'ont été ni modifiées, ni abrogées, ni annulées. En ce sens, le droit international existe. Ces règles sont posées par des organes compétents, les États et les organisations internationales. Des procédures d'édiction des normes existent. Il s'agit des règles relatives aux sources du droit international, droit des traités, éléments de la coutume, mode de prise de décision dans les organisations internationales. Le droit international contient également des règles secondaires d'entrée en vigueur, de modification, d'abrogation et d'annulation. L'existence des règles du droit international est toutefois spécifique, différente de celle des règles du droit interne, en ce que ces règles obéissent à la logique de l'accord, non du commandement, logique elle-même déterminée par la spécificité des sujets originaires du droit international, les États, des êtres souverains qui n'ont pas de supérieur en droit et qui donc ne peuvent être liés que par leur propre volonté, coordonnés à celle d'autres êtres de même nature ou à certaines conditions, exprimées unilatéralement. À la différence de la question d'existence, la question de l'effectivité, du respect et de l'obéissance au droit requiert un jugement de fait, au sens logique de l'expression, sur la base d'une démarche empirique. L'existence du droit international est-elle liée à son effectivité? Non, si l'on considère des règles particulières. Oui, si on prend globalement ce droit comme un ordre juridique. En effet, si l'existence d'une norme particulière ne dépend pas de son effectivité, la validité d'un ordre juridique est tributaire de cette effectivité. Comme l'écrit Hans Kelsen, un ordre juridique est considéré comme valable si ces normes sont efficaces, c'est-à-dire effectivement obéies et appliquées en gros et de façon générale. Le droit international est-il effectif en gros et de façon générale? Si l'on considère l'ordre juridique international dans sa globalité, dans ses différentes branches, et pas seulement ce que je nomme le droit politique international, la réponse est affirmative. Elle a été parfaitement exprimée par Louis Henkin. Almost all nations observe almost all principles of international law and almost all of their obligations almost all of the time. On peut à présent poser la question, le droit international est-il juste, équitable? Mais d'abord, justice ou équité? Les deux peuvent se dire fairness en langue anglaise. Nous nous en tiendrons à ce propos à la théorie aristotélicienne. Aristote écrit « Ce qui est équitable, tout en étant juste, ne l'est pas conformément à la loi. C'est comme une amélioration de ce qui est juste selon la loi. » Il ajoute « La nature propre de l'équité est de corriger la loi. » Il va sans dire que ce qui précède doit être compris dans le contexte et compte tenu de la spécificité du droit international, qui ignore la loi entendue comme commandement, comme ordre d'un supérieur. La justice générale ou structurale du droit international tient au fait que, je cite la CPJ, les règles de droit liant les États procèdent de la volonté de ceux-ci. L'équité est-elle une forme de justice, un correctif souhaitable en l'absence, du fait des circonstances et du rapport de force général, et en l'absence d'une contrainte illicite, les États ont dû accepter des normes matériellement injustes. En droit international, et à la différence du droit interne, ce correctif qu'est l'équité doit faire l'objet d'une autre norme, procédant également de la volonté des États, y compris celle qui donne pouvoir au juge international de statuer en équité. Si l'existence du droit requiert un jugement juridique, si son effectivité appelle un jugement de fait, le juste et l'équitable sont, eux, une question d'appréciation. Ils requièrent un jugement de valeur. Deux grandes théories s'opposent dans ce domaine. Celle qui admet la possibilité d'une vraie connaissance des valeurs acquises par une recherche rationnelle fondée sur l'observation du réel. Il s'agit de la théorie dite objectiviste des valeurs. Elle s'oppose à la théorie relativiste qui considère que les valeurs ne sont pas des propriétés objectives des choses, mais le produit d'une appréciation subjective. Le relativisme axiologique arrime le jugement de valeur au juge, à son être psychique et social, et non à l'objet jugé. En d'autres termes, les valeurs ne sont ni vraies ni fausses. Une seule et même chose peut être jugée belle ou laide, juste ou injuste. Le jugement dépend des points de vue. Ainsi, on peut considérer le droit de veto au Conseil de sécurité comme juste ou injuste. Juste si l'on considère que ce droit récompense les vainqueurs de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, sans lesquels l'Organisation des Nations Unies n'aurait pas pu voir le jour. Juste également si l'on considère que ce privilège est proportionnel à la responsabilité qu'ont ses détenteurs en matière de maintien de la paix et de la sécurité internationale. Justice distributive, donc. Mais il peut également être jugé injuste, en tant qu'il rompt l'égalité entre les États et qu'il attribue aux plus puissants plus de droits qu'aux autres. Justice commutative. Dans cette perspective, qui est la mienne, le jugement de valeur ne décrit pas un fait, une réalité, il correspond à un point de vue, à des intérêts. Il est plus utile alors, plutôt que de prétendre à une objectivité illusoire, de déterminer notre point de vue, de dévoiler notre subjectivité, afin de juger du droit de la justice, du droit international. Nous adopterons le point de vue qui correspond aux intérêts des États et des peuples du tiers-monde auxquels j'appartiens. De ce point de vue, la norme juste, comme dit Charles Cheman, est celle qui peut figurer dans l'arsenal juridique, politique et psychologique des faibles contre les forts. De ce point de vue, on va distinguer matériellement entre des règles injustes, des règles justes et des règles équitables. Sont injustes les règles qui consacrent une inégalité juridique. Représentation et vote au Conseil de sécurité dans les institutions financières et monétaires ou détention de l'arme nucléaire dans le TNP. Sont justes les règles classiques du droit international. Égalité souveraine, interdiction de l'emploi de la force, règlement pacifique des différends, non-intervention. Peuvent être enfin considérés comme équitables les principes et règles qui protègent la partie la plus faible et qui notamment peuvent à cette fin rompre l'égalité juridique formelle, établir une inégalité juridique afin de réaliser une égalité réelle. Ces principes et règles peuvent être regroupés autour de 3 axes: les droits de l'être humain, les droits des peuples et les droits de l'humanité. Les droits de l'être humain, notamment ceux qui sont défavorisés, vulnérables et aux victimes de discrimination, personnes appartenant à des minorités, femmes, enfants, personnes handicapées. Les droits des peuples à disposer d'eux-mêmes, la souveraineté permanente des peuples sur leurs richesses naturelles, le droit au développement, le droit des peuples à un environnement propre, sain et durable. Le droit international pénal, en tant qu'il sanctionne aussi bien la violation des droits des individus à la vie, à la dignité, à l'intégrité physique et morale, aux soins, à l'alimentation, crimes de guerre et crimes contre l'humanité, que le droit des peuples et des États à l'existence, génocide, agression. L'humanité, elle, est apparue en droit international, non pas en tant que telle, mais en tant que titulaire d'un patrimoine. C'est l'importance de l'objet qui a déterminé la naissance du sujet. Plusieurs objets ont été saisis comme par le droit comme patrimoine commun de l'humanité, l'espace extra-atmosphérique, la zone, le patrimoine mondial culturel et naturel, les ressources phytogénétiques, le génome humain, la biodiversité. En tant que régime juridique, le patrimoine commun de l'humanité vise, selon les cas, à son exploitation équitable au bénéfice de tous les pays, en particulier des États en développement, à sa protection ou à sa soustraction aux règles communes du commerce international. Mais il convient toutefois de noter que les règles justes ou équitables sont en droit international les moins effectives. La raison en est simple. Si les puissants ont la capacité d'imposer aux faibles le respect des règles qui les favorisent, l'inverse n'est pas vrai. Et le défaut d'effectivité de ces règles fait que de leur qualification de règles justes ou équitables un exercice purement littéraire. Du fait du temps imparti à cette communication, vous trouverez dans le texte écrit des illustrations plus détaillées de cette et de ces ineffectivités. Pour ma part, je n'ai pas observé de la part des États, je dis bien des États, pas plus ceux du Nord que ceux du Sud, une quête, et encore moins une longue quête de justice ou d'équité, mais des efforts incessants et efficaces pour la production et la reproduction d'un ordre injuste. Et le récent élargissement des BRICS, loin d'y mettre un terme, n'en est qu'une preuve renouvelée. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Ce n'est pas facile de tout dire, ce que l'on veut dire dans un temps réduit. Et je vous remercie l'un et l'autre des efforts que vous avez faits. Quite unfortunately, Judge Ineta Ziemele is not able to join us in person, but you can see her perfectly on the screen, so it gives me the impression that the devices are working well, which is always a matter of stress, but it seems to be fine. And Madam Judge, I would like to underline your deep experience. You are a professor and you have occupied several positions as president of the Supreme Court in your country, Latvia. You have been a judge at the European Court of Human Rights and presently judge at the Court of Justice of the European Union. So if I add your experience as a professor, as a judge in various tribunals, it is of course extremely interesting to hear of you. What are your opinions on these general topics for this first session? You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Daudet, and I hope you can hear me well. I would like to just have a confirmation if everything is okay. It is, yeah. Well, I am joining you from The Hague, as it were, because here at the Dutch Supreme Court, we have a parallel, indeed also very important meeting for Europe and for justice and fairness in Europe. it is the meeting of the constitutional jurisdictions of Europe, in fact, speaking about rule of law in Europe. And I will come back to, at the end of my short presentation, I will come back to the point about the importance of procedures and mechanisms. Evidently, based in my experience, I cannot not make that point. I would also like to thank very much the ESIL and the organizers, and I really know how much work goes into preparing a conference, because we had one in 2016 in Riga. It's an incredible work, and thanks for this invitation. And I would like to underline that a number of points made already by Professors Bianchi and Lakmani, in fact, I share them, and you will see in my own sort of notes that I have drafted for myself when thinking about fairness in international law. You will see that some of the points, in fact, are very similar to those that you have already heard. Now, I will try to make 4 but brief points. The first point that I would like to underline, I actually find that the fact that the ESIL, as the central subject of its conference, has identified the question of fairness in international law, to me, is a very important, as it were, development. Because indeed, as our panel rightly says, it's been a very long quest for fairness. And I find it an important, hopefully, change that will stay, that we are changing a paradigm. We are asking a question as to what is fairness. Can we agree on material aspects of it, or can we only agree on procedural aspects of it? Because for a very long time, our discipline, international law, has been dealing with the results of the famous quote of Thucydides: "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." And our profession has been confronted with this view of international law, which of course affects the discussion on the nature of international law, as already the previous speakers mentioned. And from sort of what I see is this change of paradigm, that we are approaching international law as rules, as a system of rules, from the perspective, is it fair? And to me, that is very important. And I'm sort of curious to see where the European academic reflection and also practice will go along these lines. However, as rightly said in the program, it has taken us evidently a very long time to come to discussing the idea of fairness and the principle of fairness in international law. I too share the understanding eloquently presented by Andrea Bianchi, that in fact the understanding of the fairness and being able to grow up or achieve the thinking of fairness has to do with the very evolution, with the very, it is part of human evolution. And I would like to suggest that the difficulties that we have to conceptualize fairness in international law indeed have to do with the way we, and the difficulties that we encounter in conceptualizing morality and values in our separate societies, of course, but also across our societies. And as the differences persist, which is normal, the histories are different, the historical narratives are different, there is certainly no surprise that we are still divided on what is moral, what are, if any, our shared values. And so any agreement on what is fair in various situations in this context is a very complex. I would not be surprised if somebody said even utopian enterprise. And indeed, in the absence of a single people and a single world government and some sort of social contract of what could be a more unified humanity, the sense of fairness will evidently be, in fact, different. And therefore, to build a common sense of fairness in international law remains a complex matter. But it was already stated that despite understanding these historical, anthropological, etc., sociological difficulties and barriers, there is a necessity, a fundamental necessity to have some sense of fairness of international law as well as in international law, because it is the sense of fairness that represents a claim of, for legitimacy of norms and procedures in international legal system, which as well, I mean, evidently still claims to bind as many actors as possible. And indeed, historically, I too, like Professor Lakmani, I said, well, from Thucydides, after all, we came to Louis Henkin's famous assertion in 1979, which was already quoted to you, that almost all nations observe almost all principles and rules of international law almost all the time. I would add by necessity. And so the question really is, have we moved beyond, since 1979, such an understanding of fairness, or the understanding of fairness by necessity, or fairness as self-interest? And in that context, I would like to give you a specific example. It is based indeed in my own life experience, which turned out to be an academic interest in international law. Now, I came across the notion of fairness only in the 1990s, after the Baltic states restored their independence following long decades of unlawful presence of the Soviet Union in their territories. Now, restoration of independence was that element that we were missing, our statehoods were missing for 50 years. And we considered that restoration of independence is in full compliance with applicable international rules. And we were insisting that in 1991, in fact, for the Baltic states, the World War II ended only then, and that what we inherited from the Soviet occupation is akin to post-colonial complexities. And we also insisted, as you know, that we, in fact, represent the example of state continuity as different from state succession. Now, it is in fact with such a mindset that at that time I came across the first book to my knowledge written at that time, full book devoted to the topic of fairness, that by Thomas Frank, Fairness in International Law and Institutions. However, to my great surprise, the acceptance of the Baltic claim to state continuity was not a given. And it was interesting which is unusual, but in this case, it was the politics that reacted more swiftly, recognizing that the Baltic states of 1918 are the same states as those of 1991. Now, for the academic writings, the issue was more complicated for the reasons that everybody was concerned about the continuity of Soviet obligations, and everybody was concerned that you cannot possibly imagine a revival of international obligations of the Baltic states of the pre-war time, as if this was the ultimate criteria of statehood. And so in this context, the maxim ex factis jus oritur yet again attempted to assume its power, albeit in a different legal context from that entertained by politics and philosophers centuries ago, or along many centuries. Arguably, the concerns were the treaties concerning the control of nuclear weapons and respect for human rights. However, the questions were not asked about the human rights of thousands of Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians who were arbitrarily deported to Siberia or simply killed by the Moscow regime, or about all the other violations and destructions of people's lives and the economies. To cut it short, I would not be able to claim that in the end the competing maxim of ex injuria non jus oritur has fully been implemented as far as the relevant claims of the Baltic states and their peoples were concerned. And the shadow of Thucydides is still alive, but some fairness has prevailed through the application of this competing maxim. Now, the case of the Baltic states is a good example where one can see that different fairness claims are put forward. And the different fairness claims may overlap, they can be even in conflict, and that it really depends, it has to do with different values and their prioritization. And it is my final point here on procedural fairness. It is in this context that I have come to realize that the procedural fairness, namely international tribunals, independent mechanisms, and procedures there that comply with a common sense of what are fair procedures, is a real achievement of international legal order as we have it today. And if we cannot oftentimes agree on material fairness, we can agree that through a certain fair procedure, the result will be such that we accept as fair, irrespective of whether one party wins or loses. And so the final point that I would like to make is that international and regional courts and various mechanisms, typically within international organizations, have to be seen to be legitimate, to be fair. Legitimacy is brought about through the composition of these bodies, which have to comply with fair geographic distribution idea, independent selection procedures aimed at selecting the most competent arbitrators, as well as ensuring minority representation, that relevant guarantees to ensure the independent functioning of these bodies have to be really in place. Are we there yet? We have been slowly improving, but I can tell you from my indeed daily experience that we still have a long way to go. States, and I understand why, and there is a long tradition to that, states want to have a control over the institutions, the independent institutions or expert bodies. And the states are different in terms of their approaches to the idea of the independent control over political decisions. Moreover, the internal functioning of the courts and mechanisms also can be seen as, from outside, as more or less legitimate, in other words, fair. And most importantly, the fairness of the proceedings and the quality and coherence and consistency of the decisions by all these bodies should contribute to legitimacy, and that has to be the perspective of everybody concerned, and therefore the sense of fairness. And I share the view, another book like Andrea, I also went through many books thinking about the topic. I share the view of David Lubin, who argued that the legitimacy of international tribunals, he was speaking specifically, it was in the context of international criminal law. The legitimacy of international tribunals comes not from the shaky political authority that creates them, but from the manifested fairness of their procedures, and there in the ICC context, that would be and punishments, but in general, I would say the procedures and final decisions. And so, last three sentences. Now, this procedural fairness is built by the individuals who in the end make up all these mechanisms, including the tribunals and the courts. And so it all comes down to each international lawyer aspiring one day to become either a judge or an expert or a special rapporteur. And it is also a question of certain solidarity and certain culture within our profession. And I can tell you from experience that it is really not so difficult to undermine, unfortunately, and jeopardize the faith in fairness of international mechanisms and international courts. But it is truly challenging, and especially in the age of social networks, with such a rapidity of news and fake news, to rebuild the faith into the institutions and the procedures and their fairness. And it really does take much more time in a way today than probably before. With that, I would really like to underline, if we have different values, we might sort them out in a fair procedure. Thank you.